Today, let's talk about one of the most iconic action films of the video store era. In 1986, the high-budget film Big Trouble in Little China, directed by John Carpenter, was a commercial failure, heavily criticized by all American critics. In some countries where the American press wasn't read and there was no one to talk about the movie's mediocrity and foolishness, the project was a huge success and even became one of the main hits of those years. Over time, the film became a cult classic in the United States as well, influencing other intellectual properties. Critics started to revise their reviews, this time focusing on previously overlooked aspects of the film. This was quite typical of American journalists. Before Big Trouble, they also criticized the film Blade Runner, which later achieved cult status. A few years ago, there were numerous rumors about 20th Century Fox's desire to remake John Carpenter's film. The studio was discussing the possibility of casting Dwayne Johnson in the remake. However, after Disney bought Fox, all discussions died down. It's quite possible that Big Trouble could end up as a series on some streaming platform, though without Dwayne Johnson. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, John Carpenter directed many low-budget films that did well at the box office and later achieved cult classic status. With a combined budget of $1.3 million, movies like Halloween and The Fog made $80 million at the box office. Halloween immediately turned into a franchise. After the box office success of the 1981 film Escape from New York, the director garnered attention from large Hollywood studios. Despite a sharp increase in his film's budgets, the director started to lose out on box office successes. In 1982, his film The Thing failed at the box office. Then, the same fate befell Christine in 1983, and the science fiction romance drama Starman, starring Jeff Bridges, in 1984. In 1986, it was the turn of Big Trouble in Little China. Originally, the film was supposed to be set in the late 19th century. The main character of the film was intended to be a meat delivery man for Chinese workers. Along the way, he would come across different mythical creatures involved in the criminal business related to the railway's construction. At that point in production, Walter Hill, the director behind films like 48 Hours and Streets of Fire, considered taking over the project. At the time, the tone of the film was described as a blend of Indiana Jones and Romancing the Stone. However, Walter Hill ultimately switched to directing Brewster's Millions, and John Carpenter was brought in to helm Big Trouble. Carpenter was particularly drawn to Eastern philosophy in the script. Shortly before Big Trouble in Little China, the director had been working on a martial arts film called The Ninja. The film never made it out of pre-production and was eventually cancelled. The director decided to take advantage of the opportunity and incorporate some of his ideas from the unreleased film into Big Trouble. Carpenter's new film also faced significant production challenges, partially due to the director's refusal to accept the studio's casting choices. Rumors suggest that the director intentionally extended the pre-production phase to ensure that actors Jack Nicholson and Clint Eastwood, who the studio wanted in the lead role, couldn't participate. When Eastwood and Nicholson were no longer available, Carpenter suggested casting Kurt Russell. With no other option, the studio agreed to hire the actor. In one of his interviews, Kurt Russell said that he was very afraid to take on the lead in the film because his recent works had been failing at the box office. Before signing the contract, he expressed his concerns to John Carpenter. However, he advised Russell not to dwell on such matters and said that he simply wanted to make another film with him in the lead. At the time, Kurt Russell was the top choice for the title role of the film Highlander. However, he had to decline the part of Connor MacLeod in favor of Big Trouble. Christopher Lambert quickly stepped in to replace him. After Kurt Russell joined, the film's setting was shifted from the 19th century to the present day. According to the director, he and Kurt Russell concluded that changing the time setting of the script would give them greater creative freedom. The next problem was casting an actress to play the main character's love interest. The studio strongly opposed having Ken Cattrall in this role. Studio executives believed that the actress, who had previously starred in movies like Police Academy, wasn't the right choice to play Gracie Law. They suggested that Carpenter choose another actress, but he continued to stand his ground, and the studio eventually gave in. Carpenter also wanted to cast Jackie Chan as Wang Chi. To invite the actor, he had to confront Lawrence Gordon, the head of 20th Century Fox. Gordon insisted that Jackie Chan's English was terrible and that audiences simply wouldn't understand him. However, after watching Police Story, Carpenter refused to consider anyone else for the role. As a result, the producer gave in, but Jackie Chan declined the supporting role, which then went to actor Dennis Dunn. The filming process took 4 months and was extremely difficult. According to director John Carpenter, their main problem was Lawrence Gordon. The director had to fight for every decision he made, often finding himself on the losing end of their confrontations. For example, the opening scene with the lawyer was filmed at the request of Lawrence Gordon after the main filming was completed. Gordon thought this scene would make Kurt Russell's character appear more heroic. Yet, despite his efforts, Gordon was unable to convince Carpenter to change the focus of the film. The head of the film studio didn't like that the director deliberately portrayed the Asian sidekick as a highly skilled and competent professional, contrasting with Kurt Russell's character, who once even knocked himself unconscious before a fight. Back then, minority sidekicks were typically used for comic relief, and were portrayed as inferior to the main character in every way. This was exactly what Gordon wanted in Big Trouble. In one of his interviews, Carpenter said that Kurt Russell's character wasn't the main character of the film, which is why he wanted to cast Jackie Chan as the lead, making it obvious to a much larger number of viewers. According to the director, the main character of Big Trouble in Little China was Wang Chi, played by Dennis Dun. Kurt Russell's character was actually the story's sidekick, a typical American fool in a world he doesn't understand. Realizing this, Lawrence Gordon did everything he could to make Jack Burton look more heroic. In this film, Gordon likened Kurt Russell to Robin and Dennis Dun to Batman. When filming ended and the studio received the film, John Carpenter was very concerned that it would get negative reviews after the test screenings, and that Lawrence Gordon would want to cut it. Luckily, the film didn't have any issues there. The film's test screenings went well. The audience had no major complaints about it. John Carpenter and Kurt Russell were confident that the film would be a big success. As we now know, that didn't happen. Many people attribute the film's failure to poor reviews from critics and an unfavorable release date. The head of 20th Century Fox, Lawrence Gordon, decided to release Big Trouble just 2 weeks before James Cameron's highly anticipated Aliens hit American theaters. Moreover, the film was released during a time when theaters were dominated by The Karate Kid Part 2, another movie with an Asian-inspired theme that was a sequel to one of the biggest box office hits in 1984. According to Carpenter, although he wasn't happy with the release date, he could understand the studio's decision. He said that everything was working against Big Trouble. They already had to speed up production because of Eddie Murphy's The Golden Child, which was set to hit theaters at the end of 1986. The film also contained Asian-inspired fantasy elements and, unlike Big Trouble, benefited from the presence of Eddie Murphy, who would undoubtedly attract audiences to cinemas. That's why the studio wanted to release the film a few months earlier and avoid competition with The Golden Child. Despite a $25 million budget, Big Trouble in Little China only earned $11 million in US theaters. The studio and director were extremely disappointed. Carpenter believes that despite the circumstances, the studio could have saved the film and increased its box office receipts. However, the film had a very small marketing budget considering its scale, and as a result, it simply went unnoticed by the audience. Some believe that the studio simply didn't know whether to promote it as a fantasy, an action film, or a martial arts movie. According to Kurt Russell, he knew that it would be difficult to sell the film to audiences, given that the majority of the actors in it were Asian. The film's plot was difficult to explain in a nutshell, and any attempts to do so would likely sound incoherent. However, Russell trusted Carpenter and was confident that the film would be great. As is often the case with films that later become cult classics, its failure didn't cause any harm to the people involved. On the contrary, Kurt Russell's career took off, and he began receiving offers to star in big Hollywood films. During the early 1990s, he even rose to become one of the top-tier celebrities. Carpenter also didn't face any serious consequences, and his departure from studio films was a personal choice. After completing Big Trouble, the director avoided working with major studios for several years because he was furious with Lawrence Gordon, the head of 20th Century Fox, who constantly interfered with the production. He produced his next 2 films at the independent film studio Alive Films. One of the films, They Live, also later became a cult classic. The next time he decided to work with a big studio again was 6 years after Big Trouble. The film he chose to work on was Memoirs of an Invisible Man. The project failed at the box office, and unlike before, time did not turn it into a cult classic. After Memoirs of an Invisible Man released in 1992, Carpenter made 6 more films that received theatrical releases. Each of them failed. Thanks for watching, subscribe, and stay tuned.